The mass media of the United States present Showbiz in the Streets. Showbiz in the Streets is brought to you daily by your leading metropolitan newspapers, popular national magazines, and through impartial newscasters on network TV. To these industrious dispensers of fact and information, we dedicate this film strip. America is experiencing a triple revolution, a profound revolution affecting every citizen. This is the triple revolution of the civil rights movement in urban areas, the New Left and the so-called peace movements on our college campuses, and the social revolutionaries organizing the agricultural workers in rural areas. Most Americans, relying on traditional sources of news and information, see no connection between the three. It is as if these revolutions were three independent phenomena. We hope to show they are all protagonists of the same vaudeville play, the same revolutionary stage production. While the performers do not wear grease paint or always rehearse their lines, they are nevertheless, knowingly or unknowingly, participants in one of the greatest off-Broadway dramas in the history of mankind. They are the cast of Showbiz in the Streets. It is showbiz because a relative handful of revolutionary actors traveling from area to area have created a false image of a mass movement. And with the help of enormous Hollywood-style publicity, they have profoundly influenced public opinion, enabling legislation to be passed, pushing America toward a cesspool of socialism. The revolutionaries form the cast, but the mass media gives the whole theatrical production rave reviews, and with not a hint that the whole thing really is show business. Act one of this play is the civil rights movement. The scriptwriters have portrayed the civil rights players as the downtrodden and depressed, merely taking to the streets to dramatize the deprivation of their God-given rights expressed in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. No one will deny there is some truth in this portrayal, and that many civil rights advocates are driven by sincere conviction. But the civil rights actors' production involves more than gaining access to the voting booth for qualified citizens, justice in courts, and fair opportunity for all. While cast as seekers of equal rights for minorities, the civil rights stage directors are actually building tremendous personal power and leading the country into complete socialism. Places, everyone. Lights, camera, action. Hey, James Meredith. James Meredith shot, the headlines scream. James Meredith has been assassinated, report Huntley and Brinkley. The collectivist mass media cries of the collective guilt of an entire state. Could that be showbiz? Well, let's take a hard look. Meredith was marching through Mississippi, supposedly to register voters. But the federal government had sent its own registrars months before to register Negro voters. And in the primaries, only 15% showed up to vote. Meredith, after a shouted warning, was shot twice with a shotgun by a man from Tennessee, not Mississippi, an unemployed man whose neighbors say has never expressed any political opinions. Meredith was shot from 30 yards, not with bullets, not with buckshot, but with half loads of birdshot, the kind of pellets that require full loads to kill even a dove. Meredith was not dead as implied by Huntley and Brinkley, just peppered with enough birdshot to become a martyr. A federal agent, who was very dubious about the whole performance, told a photographer, "I'd let a guy pepper me all day with half loads of birdshot from that distance. You can't hurt anybody that way." But now this segment of Showbiz in the Streets was off to a roaring start with smash reviews. Into Mississippi poured money and beatnik invaders as the civil rights directors now had a martyr, a necessary character in every civil rights stage production. This was the excuse to call for federal intervention and provide millions of dollars worth of free publicity. The civil rights leaders, as always, called for federal troops and the immediate passage of yet another in the endless line of federal civil rights bills. Demands for a federal takeover of a state and for aggrandizement of more and more power by the federal government are part of the script for Showbiz in the Streets. The walk-on part about the contriving Tennessean and his half-loads of birdshot is ignored by the media, even though this curious individual remained on stage long enough to have his picture taken. The newest and brightest star of the civil rights stage makes no attempt to disguise the fact he plays the role of the villain. His name is Stokely Carmichael, the man who contributed the cry "Black Power" to the American vocabulary during the Meredith, Mississippi March. Carmichael is a college graduate, but is cast in a costume role and usually wears bib overalls and a blue denim work shirt. In Cleveland, Carmichael recently told a screaming audience, "When you talk of black power, you talk of bringing this country to its knees. When you talk of black power, you talk of building a movement that will smash everything Western civilization has created." Carmichael is chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC, an organization which ironically rejects nonviolence. Carmichael first achieved top billing when, as a field secretary for SNCC, he helped organize the all-Negro Black Panther Party in Lowndes County, Alabama. The emblem of the organization is a pouncing Black Panther, and its motto is, "Move on over, or we'll move on over you." Carmichael states, "Our organization is not nonviolent. Nonviolence is irrelevant. We're not a protest movement. We're going to take power." According to its scriptwriters, the storyline of the Black Panther Party is to seize political control of 80% Negro Lowndes County and then place confiscatory taxes on Caucasian-owned businesses and land holdings. Carmichael puts it bluntly, "We're going to tax people the way they should be. If they don't pay them, we can auction their land to pay the taxes." Since under such circumstances there would be virtually no market for the property, the county would seize buildings and land for unpaid taxes, just as does the villain in the old-time melodrama. Here is a quasi-legal way of confiscating property and establishing a separate socialist state within a state. The Russian term for a local socialist state is Soviet. Cleveland Sellers, Carmichael's right-hand man, has succinctly spelled out the political philosophy of SNCC. "I feel capitalism is our chief enemy. Capitalism has to be destroyed." During the Meredith, Mississippi March, the following interview was recorded with Mr. Harvey Fry, a paid SNCC staff worker, on June 28, 1966. "I am not a liberal. I am not a social democrat. I am far to the left of that. I follow the teachings of Lenin." Since SNCC has never made any attempt to hide the fact it is a revolutionary organization devoted to destroying capitalism, it is a curious fact that the mass media, which never mentions the word socialism in connection with civil rights, has not focused attention on the implications of this movement. For as the Trotskyite Communist Young Socialist Alliance states in their booklet glorifying the Black Panther Party, "The Black Panther Party is setting an example which is clearly applicable not only in other rural Black Belt counties of the South, but in Birmingham, Watts, and other urban ghettos of the North and South." The sneak preview of this program is now screening in Watts, California, where SNCC, the Communist Du Bois Club, and other groups are circulating a petition to secede from Los Angeles and form an independently governed area known as Freedom City. A large portion of Los Angeles's business and industry is located within Watts and would be subjected to the taxing policies advocated by Carmichael and his supporting cast for expropriating property in Lowndes County, Alabama. If the revolutionaries are successful in turning Watts into a Soviet island, This roadshow engagement can be replayed in segments of virtually every major metropolitan area in the United States. While this may be the underlying theme of the stage play, it has not been mentioned, other than rarely, in the press reviews. While the communications industry, ignoring the real implications of black power, has publicized Carmichael and Snick, it has portrayed them as extremists, jeopardizing a worthy cause by using intemperate language. But Snick is not a small group. It has 220 full-time paid organizers, plus 300 full-time volunteers, and operates on an annual budget of $2 million. This gives Snick approximately 6 times as many full-time organizers as has the John Birch Society, the target of thousands of attacks from the same media which ignores the fact that the civil rights movement is basically aimed at destroying our traditional system of law and order. What attention has been focused on the black power and black nationalist advocates has generally been for promoting support of the demands of so-called moderate civil rights leaders as the only alternative to violence. What about these moderates? What is their alternative? The acknowledged monarch of the street revolution is the Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. No showbiz personality of the last 30 years has received as spectacular a Madison Avenue build-up as King. The media boys have built an image for King that qualifies him for the role of sainthood. King has been selected as Man of the Year by Time magazine and received the Nobel Peace Prize. Yet, everywhere this man of peace travels, violence follows like night the day. Isn't it strange that this does not seem to tarnish his show business image? Since King is one of the most influential and renowned personalities in the United States, one assumes that if he had connections with communists, this should be headline news. When in 1962, the New Orleans police raided the headquarters of the Southern Conference Educational Fund, the organization cited by investigating committees of both congressional houses as the #1 communist front organization in the South. They discovered extensive documentary evidence proving that King was working hand in glove with the Reds. The police found photostats of letters from King requesting the communists to work closely with his organization, canceled checks showing communist financial involvement with King and the civil rights movement, and even a photograph showing the 3 leading communists who run the Southern Conference Educational Fund sitting right behind King as he addresses a meeting of his own organization. All of these documents have been photostatically reproduced in a report issued by the state of Louisiana and are available to the public. This startling expose should have been the headline story of the year, but very few ever saw it in their newspapers. Nor did Huntley Brinkley do a 1-hour television documentary on King revealing his communist allies. That expose is not part of the script of Showbiz in the Streets. King has always surrounded himself with people who have very close ties with the communist conspiracy. Serving as King's advisor for Showbiz in the Streets the past 10 years has been Bayard Rustin, who by his own admission was a professional organizer for the Young Communist League for over 12 years. Here, King deplanes in Los Angeles following the Watts riots. Behind him is his advisor, Rustin. As usual, the civil rights actors proclaim that the riots were caused by discrimination, low pay, and frustration. If this were true, it should have been the police rioting. But the script calls for riots to be blamed not on inflammatory agitators, but on living conditions and police brutality. Actually, 76% of all persons arrested in the Watts riot were employed, including many in skilled, clerical, sales, and government positions. If poverty causes riots, why didn't they occur years ago when poverty was much more pronounced? The script inevitably calls for civil rights performers to cry, "Police brutality." Mayor Yorty of Los Angeles replied to King, "The cry of police brutality has been shouted all over the world by communists, dupes, and demagogues, irrespective of the facts. The date is July 10, 1966. The place is Soldiers Field, Chicago. Martin Luther King is the star performer at a freedom rally and march on City Hall. King harangues the crowd of 35,000. We are tired of withering injustice. We are tired of being lynched spiritually and economically. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Freedom is never voluntarily granted by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. This day we must decide to fill the jails of Chicago if necessary to end slums. King closed his riot-provoking speech by mentioning nonviolence. Many in the crowd laughed. They know the nonviolence bit is strictly showbiz used when King is on camera. 2 days following this inflammatory incitation to riot, Molotov cocktails rained on Chicago and the jails began to fill. While the cameras were grinding, King was of course suitably shocked. Outside of Chicago, a few newspapers reported that Mayor Daley blamed the riots on members of King's staff who, quote, came in here and have been talking for the last year on violence and instructing people in how to conduct violence, end quote. King, the Pied Piper of agitation, had played his role superbly. Now it was time for another group of players to take the stage. The Revolutionary Action Movement, RAM, a group founded by Robert Williams, a communist who fled to Cuba to avoid an FBI warrant for kidnapping. Williams broadcasts from Cuba into the United States, urging Negroes to armed insurrection, and has written a book, Negroes with Guns, published by a semi-official communist publishing house. The prologue to this book, advocating the annihilation of whites, was written by Martin Luther King. The July 19, 1966 edition of Chicago's American headlines a police report which stated the communist RAM organization was behind the riots in Chicago. A police raid on the home of Doug Andrews, 25, an organizer of teen gangs for the communist RAM, produced 23 arrests and confiscation of guns, marijuana, and civil disobedience leaflets. The paper states, during the riots, RAM officials supplied gang members with weapons, ammunition, instructions on how to make Molotov cocktails, and when spirits ran low, with wine and marijuana, end quote. The report also stated that RAM was active in many major cities. Yet, amazingly, the nationwide media ignored the fact that a riot which the mayor blamed on King's organization and which required several thousand National Guardsmen to quell was directed by the communists. Don't you think that's news? Or is it more important to preserve the crumbling image of Mr. Nonviolence? However, what has received tremendous press coverage is the agitation of Caucasians in Chicago by a handful of members of the American Nazi Party, a group that attracts mountains of publicity despite its membership not exceeding several dozen. The Nazis' assertion that the civil rights movement is communist-dominated is heard constantly. The average citizen, not told of the real facts about communism and the civil rights movement, concludes that anyone mentioning the communist aspects of civil rights is a Nazi. The Nazis are simply showbiz to smear legitimate patriots and suppress the truth. What is the strategy behind the civil rights showbiz in the streets? All over the world, communists have thrived on the creation of racial hatred, which feeds upon itself and keeps men of goodwill from meeting in rational atmospheres to find real solutions to their problems. The communists agitate to solve human problems through legislation, which seldom solves the problem but increases government power and bureaucratic red tape. Communist leader Claude Lightfoot has written, "The structure of our form of government is a tremendous obstacle to any rapid advance. Our government is divided into three power structures, legislative, judicial, and executive. All three branches have certain powers which enable a canceling out process. This so-called distribution of power is nothing more than a built-in safeguard for reactionary policies. The riots in the street, then, are showbiz to create the public opinion necessary to stimulate passage of laws concentrating power in the executive branch of the federal government, thereby eventually establishing a socialist dictatorship. Stokely Carmichael plays Mao to King's Khrushchev, thus making a false alternative look good: socialism by evolution instead of by revolution. The civil rights drama is not about civil rights, but about socialism. Civil rights is only the false mask displayed to the theater goers. Two former presidents of the American Bar Association characterized the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as 10% civil rights and 90% federal power grab. The communists rejoiced when Congress passed this federal power grab, but the rejoicing was ignored in the mass media. They were rejoicing too. Act 2 of the Communist Triple Revolution is support for the unionization of agricultural workers, now taking place in Texas and California. At stake in this drama is not really wages or hours, but control of the nation's food supply. The threat of a strike during harvest is sheer blackmail and a potential knife at America's jugular vein. This campaign started in the fall of 1965 with the so-called grape strike in Delano, California. While the media glorified the poor strikers, it neglected to mention that this strike wasn't really a strike. The picketers were in almost every case not from Delano and had never worked in the grape fields there. They were outside agitators brought in to create the fiction of a strike. It was 99% showbiz. But how could the American public know it? The mass media didn't tell them. The union claimed the workers were receiving as little as 85 or 90 cents an hour. Actual payroll timesheets of the growers showed that the workers were averaging $1.75 an hour, and many were making $4 to $5 an hour on a piecework basis. The county sheriff, Leroy Gallion, sarcastically remarked, "Most of the farm workers make more money than my deputies do, but the newspapers don't seem to be interested in pointing out that fact." But showbiz is showbiz. One prominent grower remarked, "We're just not news. The sensationalism is all on the other side. The wilder the charges against us, the more publicity it gets. Nobody seems concerned about whether it's true or not." On October 19, 1965, 44 picketers were arrested for refusal to disperse at a grape ranch in Delano. 9 of the 44 were ministers, which helped the newspaper's portrayal of the growers and the sheriff's deputies as villains. The show had been rehearsed in advance. Newsmen were flown into nearby Bakersfield and taken by taxi to Delano, where they were given prepared news releases listing the 44 pre-selected by Central Casting to violate the law and force the police to arrest them. When the newsmen arrived, the play began, and ministers were photographed being put in the paddy wagon. The entire affair would have been a credit to Cecil B. DeMille, but the mass media played it straight. It was great showbiz. Any agitator knows that when all else fails, there is always publicity in a march. Marches are great showbiz, and so in the spring of 1966, the farm workers staged a 300-mile march from Delano to Sacramento. About 75 people left Delano on the long trek. The press reported 250. Leading the parade was Cesar Chavez, founder of the Farm Workers Union, and a self-proclaimed revolutionary trained by Saul Alinsky. Alinsky describes himself as a professional radical. Chavez's attorney is Alex Hoffman, a Berkeley faculty leader in the free speech movement. According to a California Senate report, Hoffman has made little attempt to hide his Marxist convictions. Chavez's secretary is Donna Sue Haber, a national founder of the communist W.E.B. Du Bois Club. As the marchers stopped in each hamlet on their way to Sacramento, entertainment was provided by Luis Miguel Valdez. Valdez was sent to Cuba in 1964 by the Communist Progressive Labor Party for training in revolution, and has returned to play a prominent role in Delano. His communist training is apparently not considered newsworthy by the press. You see, it would be bad for the showbiz image. When the march reached Sacramento, communists gathered from all over Northern California to join the audience greeting the parade. Here, Bettina Aptheker, self-professed communist, and the moving force behind the Berkeley free speech movement, awaits the arrival of the marchers at the state capitol. This man sold communist literature while speeches were being given in the plaza of the state capitol. The march was an enormous success. A handful of people, most of whom were not farm workers, gained tremendous publicity and gave the impression that this was a mass movement which would help pave the way by creating public opinion favorable to legislate the federalization and socialization of American agriculture. The stage setting for Act 3 of the Street Revolution is the campus-based activities of the so-called New Left. The New Left is really the same old story of communist exploitation of youth, retold in the hipster vernacular of the new generation. The cast of characters is headed by a number of red diaper babies, children of old-time communists, who have matured into fiery young revolutionaries. One of the leading stars of the New Left is Bettina Aptheker, daughter of Communist Party theoretician Herbert Aptheker. She played the key role in organizing the so-called free speech movement at the University of California. Later, when the mock battles with the administration were won, Bettina admitted being a communist all along. That's showbiz. The free speech movement was an excellent example of the tried and true communist technique of giving their stage-managed dramas a misleading title. The free speech movement was not really over free speech, but the right to recruit workers and solicit funds for off-campus political activity, much of it done by non-students. This is a violation of state law. The free speech label was merely a stage name used because Americans will leap to the defense of groups claiming denial of constitutional rights. At Berkeley, however, the only group deprived of its rights is the taxpayers, who have the right to know that classroom and campus facilities are in fact being used by avowed communists to preach the destruction of America. The showbiz reviewers neglect to mention this fact. While taxpayers are subsidizing communists at Berkeley, Americans die in Vietnam. The play at Berkeley is not a comedy, it is a tragedy. From the campus, the New Left stages demonstrations against American defense of South Vietnam. Typical of these anti-American demonstrations was the International Days of Protest, enacted in Berkeley on October 15 and 16, 1965. These four individuals led a parade of 14,000 from the Berkeley campus on an attempted invasion of the Oakland Army Terminal. They are 1. Robert Scheer, an avowed revolutionary, employed by the Ford Foundation Center for Democratic Institutions. 2. Mike Meyerson, who has just returned from North Vietnam, where he was made Ho Chi Minh's honorary nephew, and who wears a Viet Cong cap and a ring made from metal salvaged from a destroyed American aircraft. 3. Berkeley faculty member, Marxist Alex Hoffman, an attorney for the Delano grape strikers. 4. Attorney Beverly Axelrod, active in communist activities in both New York and California, has traveled to the Orient to meet with the Viet Cong. With this foursome leading 14,000 people in an anti-American performance, one would expect headlines screaming, "Marxists lead huge crowd in Berkeley," or "Communist-inspired parade attracts 14,000." But the headlines told only of a confrontation of peace marchers with the police. Not a word was said about the background of the parade's organizers and leaders. Had the 14,000 sheep following the Marxist wolves known who was really staging the march, undoubtedly most wouldn't have participated. Showbiz in the Streets requires that the sincere but misguided accompany the hardcore revolutionaries in their demonstrations. Without them, the Reds would lose their false face of humanitarianism and there would be no marionettes for communist puppeteers to manipulate. If the showbiz in the streets that threatens to destroy America were exposed, it would lose its effectiveness. Why isn't it exposed? While the vast majority of newsmen have no sympathy for communism, most are graduates of liberal journalism schools, teaching that any mention of communist involvement is McCarthyism. The average reporter has not studied and therefore does not recognize communist tactics or personalities. Many journalists must cater to the ideological leanings of their superiors to keep a job, while still others are indifferent. It is easier to print a press release than to search out the facts. Regardless of the reason, the communists' showbiz in the streets could not exist if subjected to the unflattering floodlights of truthful exposure. While hypocritically proclaiming nonviolence, a handful of traveling actors is creating more racial hatred, not less, and is threatening a racial civil war. That is the way the script is written by the communists. The more bloodshed, the better. Martyrs, real or manufactured, create big box office, keeping money and recruits rolling in. Meanwhile, other actors prepare a stranglehold on agriculture while openly crying revolution. And still others recruit and train more players and directors at our universities. All three acts of this triple revolution are aimed at the establishment of socialism, either through violence or threatening violence, as an excuse to destroy free enterprise, local government, and hinder law enforcement through federal legislation. What can we do to expose and destroy the triple revolution? Facts are weapons. 1. Read It's Very Simple, The True Story of Civil Rights by Alan Stang, and Communist Revolution in the Streets by Gary Allen. 2. Join a Support Your Local Police Committee or other groups supporting law and order in our community. 3. Form a TACT Committee, Truth About Civil Turmoil. Such a committee would bring our town the facts behind showbiz in the streets. 4. Write our congressmen and senators telling them we will support a courageous stand of not giving in to the street revolutionaries' blackmail. All America has been turned into a gigantic stage where the most crucial drama in history is now playing. If the curtain is brought down on the last act, as the revolutionary directors have planned, we will enter an era which will make the Dark Ages seem like a situation comedy. The final curtain has already rung down for 1 billion of our fellow human beings throughout the world. In America, the outcome of the final act depends on the actions of this audience. Unless we rewrite the final scene of showbiz in the streets, a small but well-organized group of revolutionaries will have successfully pulled off the greatest play of all time.